Mic check 1 2 1 2. We in Trump's America. Malcolm, what you gonna do?
I'm gonna grab my passport.
Man, welcome to Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm, where we trade in personal finance advice for entertaining conversations about money, and in this instance, a more serious conversation about recent events that happened over this past weekend that we're in Charlottesville, Virginia. A whole lot of mess happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, which we all know about already. And then there's continuous news coming out even now from 45, as they say. It's just crazy what's going on, man. Do you have any hope or feelings of hope right now? And what are we supposed to be feeling right now?
I do have a little bit of hope.
Okay.
I have a little bit of hope in the sense that I was on Twitter earlier today.
Okay.
And I happened to be watching the news simultaneously, and they pointed out the fact that the 44th president of the United States, Barack H. Obama,
good old 44,
His Majesty, actually tweeted a quote from Nelson Mandela, and I can't remember the exact words of it, but it was something along the lines of, "You're not born with hate in your heart, you have to learn it."
Absolutely.
Something along those lines.
Right.
That tweet is actually the most retweeted tweet in history of Twitter.
Right.
Like that's a big deal. That many people, I can't remember what the number was. It was like 2.5 million people or something. And it's only been a day since this thing went up. Absolutely. It was like 2.5 million people or something retweeted this thing since it went up, which means that the majority of the country probably is on the right side of history.
Indeed.
And is probably focused on the right things.
Right.
It's just a small sliver of the population that just can't get right.
Absolutely. I don't know what it's gonna take to clip this faulty portion of our historic country DNA out of the gene sequence.
Right.
But I do know that it's really one question that I feel is at the core of all of this, especially for moving forward. I feel like Black folks, Latino folks, all minorities of all kind have kind of done the max of what's possible, at least at this moment, to move us forward. I think it's really now the spotlight is on white folks.
Okay.
Like, what are you willing to do, and are you willing even to sacrifice your own privilege and advantage in society from an economic standpoint, from a power standpoint, from a social standpoint, to allow America to live up to what Martin Luther King said was living up to its true meaning of its creed, in that all people can pursue freedom and justice for all and all those great things that we say the American dream is about. I think that's really the question. Are you as an individual in a place of power, or even as a regular person, willing to sacrifice that to kind of get
really
us to
tall
where?
ask.
It's a huge ask, and I don't even know. Like, would you sacrifice your advantage for some other quote unquote group of people?
Me personally?
That's a rhetorical question, of course.
Okay, because I was going to ask you what advantage do I even have.
And that's the theoretical question, essentially, because for people who are out there protesting, who are on the right side of history, so to speak, they're working against what would otherwise be in their best interest to maintain the structure of society today. So it's an interesting,
If you look at the demographics, though, of everything we've seen on the news, all the coverage for the last couple of days, the demographics of who you see on your TV screen is not black, brown, blue, purple people of any sort, not in any major numbers. So to answer your question, I think you do have folks on both sides who just so happen to share the same privilege, and some people that are saying, I'm willing to get out of my comfort zone and make a difference, and some people who are saying, I see the country changing before my very eyes, and I don't like what I see. Right. Because statistically, this is the second year in the history of this country where there are more kids starting the first grade in 2007, or more kids started the first grade in 2017 who are non-white than were white. Right. That's the second year in a row that this has happened. Right. That's a huge culture shift. Absolutely. If you think about the fact that, like, the folks who we technically consider to be minorities, that means that once those kids come to be the adult population, immigration aside, once those kids who are in kindergarten today come to be the adult population 12-ish years from now, that's who's going to make up the complexion of this country in the majority. Absolutely. So if you're a person who's enjoyed that privilege you're talking about for as long as this country's been created, that scares the crap out of you. Absolutely. And that essentially, I think, is what the root of the majority of all the backlash, if you will, that we're seeing is.
Absolutely. White guys making a comeback as a historically disadvantaged minority. So anyway, we want to remind people you're listening and watching, Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. That will conclude for this moment, this edition of Woke Street instead of Wall Street, Woke Street. And today's conversation at hand for this episode, what will it take for millennials to be able to retire? An interesting question that just came across my mind. We've done a couple of really abstract ideas and shows recently. So I wanted to get back to basics. But before we get into today's show, what will it take for millennials to be able to retire? We got to do headlines. The headline that we pulled for this week's show: rich San Francisco residents get a shock. Someone bought their street. An August story in the San Francisco Chronicle by Philip Madier and Andrew Ross explains the story of a South Bay San Francisco couple who purchased a private street of a gated, wealthy community in San Francisco. Tina Lamb and Michael Chang snatched up Presidio Terrace. I think that's how you pronounce it. Presidio Terrace. The block-long private oval street lined by 35 mega million-dollar mansions. They snagged this street for $90,000 in a city-run auction stemming from an unpaid tax bill. Tina and Michelle were looking for ways to cash in on their purchase, possibly by selling the parking spaces on the street. So just to give a little background about this story, apparently there's a community, like think a gated community in San Francisco, and this gated community, obviously everyone owns the homes, but the street is technically still designated or still owned by the city.
Right.
And they have to pay taxes on that street. Now, as we go further down into the story, the type of people that live on the street, just to give you kind of an example of who lives there, Senator Dianne Feinstein and her husband, Richard Blum, House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi, and the late Mayor Joseph Alito. And they also said that a guard is stationed round the clock at the Stone Gate entrance. In a letter to the city last month, the attorney for Presidio Homeowners Association said the group had failed to pay because its tax bill was being mailed to Kearny Street address used by an accountant who hadn't worked for the homeowner since the 1980s. So essentially they were sending the tax bill to the wrong place. And 2 years ago, the city's tax office put the property up for sale on an online auction. And that's where Michael Chang and Tina Lamb, this couple, actually pounced on the offer, and they snatched up, they kind of did the outbid, I think it was like online, for $90,000. And then one of the quotes from Michael Chang was, "We could charge a reasonable rent on it." So essentially, this couple is holding this street hostage and holding it over their heads that they now own this street inside of this private gated community.
Right.
Which is interesting.
Good for them. I mean, seriously, like
Right.
essentially, that's the way. I hate to say it this way, but that's the way the game works.
Absolutely.
And so good for them for figuring out how to play it to their advantage.
Absolutely.
Because if you think about like cities like DC where we live, or Baltimore or Chicago,
Right.
or places like that, when you look at the fact that like all these different high-end condo and apartment buildings keep going up in communities where it looks like nobody who lives around there has the income to support it,
Right.
i.e. gentrification, right? If you look at how that's possible, it's because of stupid loopholes and technicalities like this,
Right.
where somebody didn't pay their tax bill
Right.
for $15,
Right.
or they didn't pay their water bill to the city for 3 years in a row because they're on a fixed income, or it got by, whatever. They lose the house that's in a prime territory that's slated for a rebuild, all over like $500 at the most. And then a developer gets to come in, build property there that's now worth millions of gazillions of dollars. And that person who lost their house based on the technicality is way out in the middle of nowhere looking at the cranes rolling and going, what did I do? In this case, they turned it on its head and said, y'all weren't paying attention. I was.
I got you.
Right. Now, rent is due on the 1st.
Right.
If it's paid after the 5th, it's late.
Street rent.
And that, good for them.
Right. Real quick, a couple extras. Obviously, the homeowners of the street are not happy. They petitioned the Board of Supervisors for a hearing to rescind the actual tax sale, and the board has scheduled a hearing for October. They've also sued the city and the couple to prevent them from like charging or doing anything with their ownership until like it's been resolved. And then another quote from Tina Lamb, the woman who's actually the part owner of the street, says, "I'm a first generation immigrant, and the first time I came to San Francisco, I fell in love with the city. And she's an engineer in Silicon Valley, and she was born in Hong Kong and came to the U.S. for college.
That's Silicon Valley engineer money. That's how she can afford to just buy a street.
Absolutely.
Just because she wants to.
Absolutely. And it's interesting detail, like the final line of the story says, there's a bit of irony in the couple's purchase. Until 1948, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that banning the enforcement of racial covenants, homes in Presidio Terrace could be purchased only by white folks. So that was like a particular irony that they came in and bought this street from under essentially, wealthy people who are living there. But is this like a really good example of like American capitalism, like, and using the system to your advantage?
I think two things. I think very quickly, stories like this are the reason that we had to run the story we ran at the top of the show about the outrage that the country is seeing toward, different people.
This is what we're talking about.
This is exactly what this is. You're taking advantage of the game.
You now know the game like I know the game.
And you're coming from the outside because she's a first generation immigrant, engineer, making Silicon Valley money. Doctors can't afford to live in Silicon Valley.
Right.
So that tells you what kind of money is being thrown around in communities like Presidio Terrace. So, I mean, there's that aspect of it. Right. But then also, like, you have to consider the fact that it's capitalism at its worst, to some degree, because if you think about, like, aside from all the people who have high class problems, like somebody bought my $90,000 street and is charging me rent on it, that's a high dollar problem I hope to one day have to fight my way through, right? But the fact that it exists and can happen in Silicon Valley out in California means it also can exist in places closer to home where folks can't afford just to even go schedule a hearing to fight it out and just have to kind of put up with it and get pushed out of the neighborhood and so on. So that's where I think capitalism gets a little ugly, and then it becomes, things have gone a little bit too far in one direction. So I respect it, I appreciate it. The capitalist in me looks at it and goes, good for you. But then I also have to consider the ramifications of the snowball effect. Like, it starts there, and then where does it
other
end?
people in other communities, if their streets were able to be purchased up from under them in that same way.
And these are people of means, access to resources, higher education, things like that. What happens to the folks who, I read this story in my neighborhood in Minnesota and go, oh, I'm gonna go check and see if I can push my neighbors out too. And now, people who can't necessarily afford to fight this thing out in court and so on are negatively impacted far more than Nancy Pelosi.
Absolutely. We want to remind folks, you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money. We're going to take a really quick music break in a moment, but we want to remind folks that you can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/Manage Your Damn Money. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter. What's your handle, Malcolm?
At Malcolm on Money.
And of course, mine is MYDM with a 1 at the end. And you can always listen to podcast episodes that we've done in the past. Those are available on Apple Podcasts. Simply search Manage Your Damn Money or SoundCloud.com/Manage Your Damn Money. And remember to leave us a review, especially on Apple Podcasts, because that's where it can help us raise in the ratings and let people know how good of a job we're doing this show. So this is Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We're going to take a real quick break here from Mr. Beats by Beeman. Manage Your Damn Money. We will be right back.
Listen. Now listen.
This is Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We're back, and today's conversation at hand: what will it take for millennials to be able to retire? Malcolm, this is really a important, basic question. Millennials face an incredible mountain to climb to reach retirement. The Great Recession, over $1.4 trillion in student loan debt collectively, with each of us averaging like $30,000 of it. Real wages that haven't risen in years, and a working world that is becoming increasingly fragmented for those working blue-collar and even white-collar jobs, obviously with technological advances being a huge cause of that. That's why we're taking it back to personal finance basics and asking the question of what it will take for millennials to retire. Really, this is one of the main things when you talk about personal finances and money is like, saving is great and all those things, but part of why we go to work and all that is the thought that one day you might not have to work, right? So it's a really important topic. And so we started off by looking at how retirement was invented, right? Because that's not something that I actually knew or thought I knew. And so I saw and found a 2014 article in The Atlantic by Sarah Lasco, which explained the history and origins of the notion of retiring from the workforce and supporting the needs of the elder population. And actually, the story said in 1881, Otto von Bismarck, a conservative minister and president of Prussia, which I think is a part of Germany or was a part of Germany, presented a radical idea to the Reichstag, which is like the government, I guess, body, about a government-run financial support system for older members of society. In other words, retirement. The idea was radical because back then, people simply did not retire. If you were alive, you worked, probably on a farm, or if you were wealthier, you managed a farm or larger estate. And it took 8 years from when he had the idea, but by the end of that decade, the German government would create a retirement system which provided the citizens over the age of 70 if they lived that long. And that says if, because at that time 70 was about the max life expectancy, so they put it right out of the reach of most people. But like when we saw this, that retirement kind of was conceptualized in 1881, like what did you think?
It surprised me a little bit in that when you hear folks talk about the good old days, so to speak, right? You hear people talk about how it used to be. Right. Folks talked about working with like such a sense of pride. Right. And it wasn't about, oh, I hope one day I don't have to work. It was like, you're going to have to drag me away from this place. Right. Because that's just what you do. Right. You get up every day, you put your shoes on, you walk out the door, and you go to work. Absolutely. And it was like a badge of honor. Right. And then all of a sudden it became this thing where it was like, well, what happens when the day comes that I finally don't have to work anymore, and I have enough money to sustain my life after I stop working until I die? Right. And then that was like a radical idea at one point. Right. And then enough people jumped on the bandwagon and said, yeah, like that gives me something to look forward to every day when I get out of bed and put my shoes on and leave the house. And then that kind of changed work culture because everybody's kind of in on the same idea, which is that we're doing this now, but we aren't doing it forever. Absolutely. If that makes sense. Absolutely. And also in that era, so the 1880s, military pensions were a little bit more common, but they didn't necessarily allow you to stop working. So you could get stuff for being in the military. And then in the United States, starting in the mid-1800s, certain municipal employees, including firefighters, cops, teachers, mostly in big cities, started receiving public pensions too. And in 1875, I think this was kind of like the watershed moment, at least for Americans. In 1875, the American Express Company started offering private pensions. By the 1920s, a variety of American industries, from railroads to oil to banking, were promising their workers some sort of support years after they had finished working. And that was kind of like the era of, company-sponsored pension programs, which people, especially like our grandparents, were familiar with. I've always said over and over again that my grandparents are living on a retirement package of sorts from 2 different municipalities in California. My grandmother's been retired longer than she ever worked. That's beautiful. That's the life I'm trying to live. Right. I think we all would. They're going on a cruise. They left on a cruise actually yesterday. Another 40-day cruise. Another 30 to 40-day cruise. I have no idea where they're going, but Reverly's surely going to come back and tell me. But most pension programs chose the magic number of 65 as the number for like retirement. And then as far as Americans are concerned, the Social Security Act was passed in 1935, and the official retirement age was 65.
And then the life expectancy for American men was about 58.
Right.
So the Social Security Act was passed.
Versus 92.
Versus
today.
what it is, it's 92 now. So,
92 for men, 96 for women.
Is that what it is?
Yeah. So just think
wow.
about how the life expectancy has shifted.
Right. Wow. And the law hasn't changed at all, to my knowledge.
As far as it shifted by like 6 months for what counts as like full retirement
That's
age.
not much.
So it went from 66 to 66 and a half. But that's the whole reason, and we'll get into it in a minute, but
Absolutely.
that's the whole reason you hear this debate over who should be eligible for Social Security and blah, blah, blah.
Absolutely. But by 1960, the life expectancy, as Malcolm mentioned, in America was almost 70 years. All of a sudden, more people were living past the age where they had permission to stop working and had the money to do it. Today, or at least in this article, 2014, the Social Security Administration estimates that there are 38 million retired people in the United States. So that's pretty interesting. The rise and demise, first of all, the pension programs. Were pensions or retirement plans for after you started working, was that even ever really realistic to promise something beyond your company's like purview?
Sure. Well, it is because, for one thing, there were far fewer companies back then than there are now.
That is very true.
And there are also far fewer major corporations. Like
Right.
American Express is a big deal today,
Right.
but it was a far bigger deal back then.
Right.
And consider like, your larger defense companies and your public utility companies and those kind of folks.
Right.
They were like it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's
so
true.
they were fewer and further in between. There was once upon a time IBM was like the computer company.
Right, the
And
only
now
one.
we've got, however many thousands competing for space.
Right.
So pensions made sense because workers weren't going to leave you because they didn't have anywhere else to go. But then also when you put the handcuff of, if you stay here long enough, I'll take care of you in the
Absolutely.
5 years of retirement that you have to look forward to.
Absolutely.
That made some sense.
Right.
Like, and then all of a sudden science got better and people started living longer.
Right.
And the companies, in order to stay competitive with each other, had to continue offering these pensions.
Right.
So GE and IBM and whoever else in the 50s and 60s and 70s, as they're hiring people, has to continue to offer these pensions,
Right.
even though people are living 10 and 15 years longer than they were when they initially put them in place.
Absolutely, absolutely. We want to remind you, you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We're discussing what it will take for millennials to be able to retire. We're going through a little bit of the history of the idea of retirement. We were just talking about pensions. Were pensions also something that was a response to like a boom in the American economy? Like, I think that was like, correct me if I'm wrong, that was about the tail end of like the industrial-ish era, was it not?
Yeah, and also you had a lot of people leaving the battlefield. So you had two
Right.
wars that came through.
Right.
And a lot of people leaving the military and going to work.
Right.
And so those folks, again, the companies had to be competitive
Right.
with who they were trying to hire.
Absolutely.
Those folks leaving the military were leaving pensions.
Right.
And so you had folks leaving the military, starting a company,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to then bring over their buddies also from the military.
Right.
Who knew that if they stayed in the military as a lifer, a
Right.
career military veteran,
Right.
they'd have a pension to look forward to.
Right.
Well, I've got to offer you something competitive to that to make you want to come, work for IBM or what. I keep using them, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question that I have. Do we still owe ourselves to retire, considering like now we live a lot longer? But we still assume that we have a right at some point to retire. Like, is that even something we're owed still today, considering how things have changed?
So here's the challenge to that. And I'm going to attack the question you're asking, specifically the word owed.
Okay.
So you and I work for a living.
Mm-hmm.
We pay Social Security taxes.
Yes.
I've been paying Social Security taxes since I was like 14 years old.
Right.
That is an implicit promise
Right.
from the U.S. government
Right.
that if you continue to pay into this system
Right.
while you are a working adult,
Right.
when you finally get to be of age, a full retirement age,
Right.
we will then turn around and dole out those dollars that
Back
you
to
have
you.
paid into that system for
Right.
the last 30 years or, whatever your career is.
Right.
So do I think that I'm owed retirement in that sense? Very specifically? Absolutely. Otherwise, we're talking about the largest Ponzi scheme in the history of the world.
Right.
If by the time you and I get ready to retire, there's no money there to pay us from what we have contributed to that pool.
Right.
So in that regard, yes, I'm absolutely owed retirement money because I'm the one who fronted it, 30, 40 years earlier.
Right. Let me ask you this though, because you're a licensed financial advisor. Is the trend like retirement and do nothing, or is the trend like retire from a primary profession, especially for people who are like retiring today, and transition into something that's maybe a little less strenuous or a little like maybe a secondary career? Like, is that what do you see happening there?
Yes and no. I think it's some of both and all and everything in between.
Okay.
Like, there's probably three answers to that question. So you do have the folks who won't be able to retire completely because they can't afford to.
Right.
And that's usually the example you see on every show is the Walmart greeter, right? The person who's a little bit older, doesn't necessarily look or act like they want to be there,
right,
but they got to be somewhere because they need a check.
The Walmart greeter.
So that's usually the example that people will use. And so, in that instance, you're not necessarily young enough to work in the place that you used to,
right,
but you still need an income.
Absolutely.
Then you also have the people that are kind of like me, that they probably would be retired for all of a month and then get fidgety and need something to do to occupy their time and stimulate their brain.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, they have a full-time job all over again.
Right.
But fortunately, the way the country is set up, in your old age, you get to be a consultant, work half the amount of hours, make twice as much money. And technically, you're retired. You're old enough to receive your pension and your Social Security and everything else.
Right.
So technically, these are retired folk, but realistically, no, they make more money than they did when they were leaving the house every day.
Absolutely.
And then you do have the folk that I was talking about earlier who were like, man, as soon as I hit 65 or whatever the number is, I'm done.
Right.
I'm never working another day in my life, and there's nothing anybody's ever going to be able to tell me about it. And it is what it is. If I have $5 to live off of, I'm going to live off of $5. Because when I hit 65, that's all you're getting.
It's a wrap.
So, you get some of all of it.
Absolutely. We're going to take another quick music break and hear from another piece by Mr. Beats by Beeman. He is the executive producer of this show and also creates the music. So check his stuff out on Instagram at Beats by Beeman. We also want to remind folks to subscribe to us on SoundCloud. Just search Manage Your Damn Money, and also on Apple Podcasts, where you also should leave us a review. This is Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We're discussing what it will take for millennials to be able to retire. We will be right back. Welcome back to Manage Your Damn Money. My name is Ben, and this is Malcolm. We're talking today about what it will take for millennials to be able to retire. And so we took a look at another article that was out recently. The story went, or the title went, Millennials, Here's How You Retire by 40. This was an August 8th, 2017 NerdWallet article by Ariel O'Shea, which explains the ins and outs of working towards a quote-unquote early retirement. Knowing what you plan to spend in retirement can help you game out what you need to save to live at a certain level by your retirement age. Let's say you're 25 now, earn $50,000 a year, and want to retire by 40. According to NerdWallet's retirement calculator, you can do that if you're willing and able to save 48% of your income for the next 15 years.
Okay, so if you're willing to be one of those millennials they write all these articles talking trash about, who live in the basement with mom and dad, because there's no way you're living
for 48%,
on $25,000 a year, basically.
None. Right. So that will give you roughly $1,300 a month in retirement, which is your current income adjusted down for taxes, savings, and those general work-related expenses that will disappear. The article went on to talk about when you deal with the numbers, you may find that shooting for early retirement might be super ambitious and almost undoable. Like Malcolm said, you might end up having to live in your parents' basement almost forever. Or at least until late adulthood. And the story suggests cutting away large expenses to save as much as possible, moving to lower places where you pay lower rent, and then moving back in with parents, obviously, and cutting transportation costs. And then the story also encouraged engagement of side gigs to bring in additional income. And obviously, something that we always talk about, maxing out 401ks and Roth IRA contributions and things like that. Is that even realistic to say that somebody could save half of their income? And if they're making 50 grand a year in any kind of city where you can usually make that amount of money, you're not going to be able to save half of that.
If you are that rare anomaly that doesn't have to factor housing costs into your monthly budget, it is absolutely doable.
Okay.
As soon as you bring, because your largest expense, especially in 2017, is going to be housing, and well and away. Like it's not even a close competition. Right. So if you somehow are able to get rid of that cost, then yes, it's absolutely fathomable to think that you could save half of what you make, because that's the half that's going to housing. Right. And do it consistently for 15 years, as long as all of a sudden you're not paying for housing. Right. Outside of that, I don't really see it likely. But then also, whenever you look at scenarios like this, they're assuming that people will stay as financially disciplined
through the whole way,
as they are when they start down this road.
And as you grow your money, you typically, especially if you're a normal person, you're going to take some liberties here and there.
Not even that, just human nature. Like, think about, and you've probably heard me say this a million times to this point, but the Netflix documentary "What the Health" that came out. Right?
So I actually am not watching that on purpose.
So I haven't seen it either, and I refuse to. Okay. But everybody who watched it suddenly became a vegan. Right. They saw the light. They decided, I don't want to eat animal meat. Right. I don't want to eat animal flesh anymore. I don't like what I read about. I heard about eggs, and all of a sudden you check in, and I've been guilty of trolling people on Facebook and asking. I'm checking in. It's been 3 weeks. Are you still a vegan, or are you making accommodations? It's been 5 weeks. Are you still a vegan, or are you? And I stopped getting responses. I'm so around like the 3 week mark. I noticed. I know, but like I noticed everybody who's a staunch vegan about 3 weeks in, they go, man, I rode past Five Guys the other day.
That Chipotle,
and it had me, and I had to pop in. And that's essentially the same thing that happens with your financial discipline. Right. You're like, man, I was walking through the mall the other day. Shouldn't have been in the mall in the first place. I was walking through the mall the other day, and I saw these Jordans. They just retroed, and I had to spend that $225. Well, there goes the budget. And then it's a slippery slope from there. Right. So if you can keep that financial discipline through that entire
15, 20 years.
Right, when you're preparing. And then also keep that financial discipline, more importantly, in retirement. Right. Because that's where it really matters, being able to stick to that budget when you don't have any additional dollars coming in on the back end.
What does the grandma call it? A fixed income.
Right. You are really on a fixed income at that point.
Absolutely.
So, it's doable for sure, but just understand how many pieces are going to have to be given up along the way. And then, what's a life without every once in a while having some
enjoyment?
I know you probably can't believe that I'm saying that, but like every once in a while you have to treat yourself.
Absolutely. And then a little bit about turning our attention to retirement today. What does it take kind of to get in the right mindset and the right scenario, so to speak, when you're in your 20s or like early 30s getting ready for retirement? Like, you have the benefit of thinking about retirement that early. Mm-hmm. What are the basics that you have to do, like, to kind of get ready?
The biggest one is stop saying I'll worry about it tomorrow.
Right.
Like, I get that a lot. Like in our peer group, when I have conversation with people and they'll ask me some generic question, and then, it leads to like, have you gotten started?
Right.
No, because. Right. No, but. I know I should, but.
However.
And then all of a sudden we're 35, 45, 55. And, I'm like, at this point, there's nothing I can tell you that, I didn't already tell you 30 years ago. Right. So the biggest thing is everybody thinks that they have tomorrow. Right. And then it becomes tomorrow. And then the day after that and the day after that. When realistically, the earlier you get started, even with the smallest increments of money, the better off you're going to be.
Absolutely. Some other things to turn your attention to retirement today. Getting the right attitude. Obviously, saving for retirement is about sacrificing now for later, which can be hard to do. You have to set aside today's pleasures for tomorrow's leisures. And it's interesting because I once saw this budget online somewhere of this person who made, like, between the family, the wife and the husband, I guess, it was like they made like $400,000, like some crazy amount. Mm-hmm. And I want to say they might have lived in New York. Like, they definitely lived in a high, rent district, so to speak.
Right.
But they were maxing out all of their retirement tools. So like work, 401k, IRA on both ends were maxed out. And it was interesting because they said, how can you make this much money and still feel broke at the end? And it's interesting because even though, obviously having a household income of $400,000 a year isn't a problem, you can still, even in your own situation, knowing that you're doing the best for later and still making a decent amount of money, you can still feel broke if you're making the proper contributions to like retirement. It's kind of like a weird reverse. Like
that's a temporary problem.
Discomfort.
Like if you make $400,000 and you're spending $399,
right?
Now you have a problem,
right?
And you legitimately are broke,
right?
If you make $400,000 and you're saving 100 of it.
It was a legitimately responsible budget. What I saw, whatever thing I was reading, it was like legitimate. Like, oh, they're doing what they're supposed to do, but they still felt as if they didn't have any room to like wiggle around.
Boo hoo, like you know what I mean, like.
Right. But I'm saying when you scale that down to somebody who's making $50,000 a year,
totally different scenario.
That might feel like a heavier burden to make that contribution to the IRA and to the 401k.
But I think it's also. You made the perfect illustration about being in the right mindset.
Okay.
Now, if you are a person who makes $400,000 and you feel like you felt when you made $50,000, like you feel like money's still that tight,
right?
But it's because you're satisfying all these different savings goals,
right?
Well, then you have the right mindset and actually think about money properly. In that you're not throwing it all away and saying, well, we're going to make this same $400,000 every single year until we die. And so there's really no need to worry about tomorrow because we want to live for today.
Absolutely.
That's a totally different scenario. So
definitely. I want to remind folks you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money. Another thing to do when you're ready to turn your attention to retirement today, you got to make sure you cover the basics. You got to open and max out an independent, low-fee Roth IRA, which we've talked about on this show. Just check some previous episodes. And then also max out your employer-based 401k plans, which people always talk about. Get those max contributions from your employer if they offer one. And then obviously keep track of all retirement benefits earned from your employer. I have a document in my like important documents folder, which is a document that I have to send to Los Angeles County because I have, last time I checked, probably 8 years ago, I have like $1,000 sitting in a retirement thing from my job when I was in camp. So it was an interesting like example of my own, like I know I have to go back and get this and I know I have that. Right. So like I'm gonna make sure that.
So you have to physically go there, or you can call somebody.
As I understand it, I like just have to send in the document.
Okay.
So another thing that you have to do obviously is normalize habitual saving. Having a rainy day fund is something that will help build the habits that you need later, to make the sacrifices that you need to have enough money for retirement. And then also you gotta, when you're married or you have a spouse, you have to consider this conversation. This is big because if you guys have different ideas of what retirement means, then you have to make sure you're like on one accord with that.
Sure.
Which is a big deal. And then also obviously knowing your target number, know the age you'd like to retire by, and reverse engineer the amount you would need to be able to live comfortably.
That is actually the number one most important question that you have to figure out the answer to when you start to have the retirement conversation. Okay. Is what is the amount that I'm going to need once I retire? Right. On a monthly basis, not even necessarily just a dollar. Like every single month, how much am I going to need coming in? Right. And then work your way backwards from there. Right. That's the most important question to answer. And I know it's tough to answer it 40 years out, presumably, right? Right. But once you can actually answer it, that's what matters.
Right. And a real quick caveat, we mentioned Social Security earlier in the show. You can actually check to see what your expected Social Security return would be. You just Google like Social Security estimator or something like that, and it's like on an official government website. I actually looked mine up based on like a $51,000 salary, and I think if I collected at the max or the retirement age, which is like you said 67 and a half, my contribution from the government would be like $2,300 a month. So I could like equate that theoretically, as long as it's there, back into my equation for retirement. Yeah. So anyway, you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money. We're going to take a real quick music break and then wrap up the show when we come back. Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We'll see you on the other side. We're back here on Manage Your Damn Money, wrapping up this show. Another good show about retirement, some basics on retirement. Malcolm, I hope we do all right here in the United States of America.
We'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see if we're here,
next week. We're going to go home and watch the news and see what's going on. But we want to remind people you can always catch us on manageyourdamnmoney.com if you need us or want to send us an email. It's info@manageyourdamnmoney.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts. Simply search Manage Your Damn Money, and soundcloud.com/Manage Your Damn Money. Another great show here on with myself and Malcolm. See you next time. Until then, be good with your money.
Peace.
Peace.